I was standing in my own kitchen when I heard my son's voice through the phone he'd left on the counter, cold, impatient, unrecognizable. "Just put her in a nursing home already," Ethan said. "We can't keep waiting forever." For a moment, I didn't move, not because I didn't understand, but because I suddenly understood everything. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I stayed awake, thinking. And by sunrise the next morning, I had already started selling everything they thought they would one day own. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I want you to stay with me. Like this video, subscribe if stories like this speak to you, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? My name is Lily Thompson. I'm 68 years old, a widow, and until recently I believed I understood my place in this world and in my own family. I live just outside Asheville, North Carolina, in the same house my husband James and I bought nearly 40 years ago. Back then it wasn't much. Just a modest 2-story home with creaky floors, a backyard full of stubborn red clay, and more potential than comfort. But to us, it was everything. It was the first place that truly belonged to us. James used to say that stability wasn't something you found, it was something you built piece by piece, day after day, even when you were tired, even when things felt uncertain. And we did exactly that. We started with very little. James worked long hours in commercial construction, often leaving before sunrise, and coming home with dust still clinging to his boots. I ran a small home decor business out of our garage, at first handmade wreaths, refurbished furniture, seasonal pieces I sold at local markets. It wasn't glamorous, but it grew. Slowly, steadily, just like everything else in our lives. We saved carefully. We invested when we could. We learned from our mistakes. Over the years, what we built turned into something solid: rental properties, retirement accounts, a comfortable cushion that meant we never had to depend on anyone else. That independence mattered to me. It still does. When James passed away 8 years ago, it felt like the ground beneath me shifted in a way I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. Grief isn't loud the way people expect. It's quiet. It lingers in empty chairs and routines that suddenly stop in the silence at the end of the day when there's no one left to share it with. But even in that silence, I held on to what we had built. I kept the accounts in order. I managed the properties. I downsized the business but never fully let it go. It gave me purpose, structure, and something to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. And then there was Ethan, my son. For most of his life, Ethan was kind, protective, the kind of boy who would hold the door open without being asked who would call, just to check in, who would show up with groceries when I caught the flu without making a big deal out of it. After James died, Ethan stepped in even more. He visited, often fixed things around the house, insisted I wasn't alone. There were moments, quiet ones, when I thought maybe I had done something right as a mother. But something began to change. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. The shift started after he married Rachel. Rachel is polished. That's the word people tend to use. She dresses impeccably, speaks with careful precision, and has a way of smiling that never quite reaches her eyes. When I first met her, I told myself not to judge too quickly. Not every warmth looks the same. Not every person shows kindness in obvious ways, but over time I began to notice things. Small things at first. The way conversations changed when I entered the room. The way Rachel would gently redirect topics away from memories, away from shared family stories, and toward practical matters. Finances, planning, efficiency. She liked things organized, controlled. At family dinners, she would ask questions that sounded harmless on the surface. "Have you thought about simplifying your finances, Lily? Do you still manage all your accounts yourself?" It must be stressful handling everything alone. Each question came wrapped in concern, but there was something underneath it, something I couldn't quite name at the time. Ethan at first would brush it off. He'd squeeze my shoulder, smile, tell Rachel Mom's got it under control. And for a while, that was enough. But gradually, his tone began to shift, too. He started asking more specific questions. Not just how I was doing, but how things were structured. How many properties are you still managing? Do you have someone helping you with taxes? Have you updated your will recently? At first, I answered without hesitation. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. But then came the suggestions. Maybe it's time to make things easier on yourself. You don't need to carry all this responsibility anymore. We can help you manage everything. That word started to appear more often, and with it came a subtle but undeniable change in how I was being seen. I wasn't the one in control anymore, not in their eyes. I was becoming a concern, a responsibility, a problem to be solved. Visits became less about connection and more about observation. Rachel would walk through my house with a careful gaze as if evaluating it. She'd comment on things I had never thought twice about. That rug could be a tripping hazard. These stairs seem steep. This layout isn't ideal long-term. Always phrased as care, always delivered gently, but repeated often enough it started to feel like something else entirely. Even Ethan began noticing things he had never questioned before. "Mom, you forgot to return my call yesterday. Did you leave the porch light on all night? You seem tired. Are you getting enough rest?" Individually, each comment was small, understandable. Together they formed a pattern, a narrative, one where I was slowly, quietly being positioned as someone who could no longer fully manage her own life. I told myself I was imagining it, that grief had made me sensitive, that I was reading too much into things. But then there were the conversations about the future, not in broad, comforting terms, but in timelines. We should start planning ahead. It's better to make decisions early. You don't want to wait until something happens. Something happens. That phrase lingered with me longer than I expected, because I realized they weren't talking about possibilities. They were talking about inevitabilities. And somewhere in those conversations, I noticed something else. They never asked me what I wanted. Not really. They presented options. They suggested paths. They framed things as logical next steps. But my voice, my preferences, my autonomy, those were slowly being edged out of the conversation. And the strangest part, they probably believed they were being helpful. That's what made it so difficult to confront, because nothing was overtly cruel. Nothing was openly hostile. It was all wrapped in concern, in reason, in the language of care, which made it easier for everyone else to accept, and harder for me to question. But deep down, something inside me had already begun to shift, a quiet awareness, a growing discomfort I couldn't ignore. I started paying closer attention to what was being said, to what wasn't being said, to the way decisions were being discussed around me instead of with me. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I had never truly felt before, not as a wife, not as a mother, not as the woman who had built her life from the ground up. I felt replaceable, not as a person, but as a decision maker, as someone whose life could be reorganized by others as long as they believed it was for the right reasons. And I didn't yet know how far they were willing to go, but I was beginning to understand one thing very clearly. This wasn't just about concern, it was about control. And I had no idea just how close they already were to trying to take it from me completely. If you had asked me then before everything became undeniable, I might have told you I was simply being cautious, maybe even overly sensitive. After all, there's a certain narrative society likes to place on women my age, that we worry too much, that we misinterpret things, that we hold on to tightly to independence when we should be learning how to let go. So for a while, I tried to see things the way Ethan and Rachel presented them. Helpful, responsible, loving. But the truth has a way of revealing itself not in grand dramatic moments, but in small repeated patterns you can no longer ignore. It started with my memory, or rather, their version of it. Mom didn't. I already tell you that Ethan would say casually sometimes, with a small laugh sometimes, with a faint edge of concern. At first I would pause, not because I truly didn't remember, but because I didn't remember him telling me twice. Rachel was more subtle. She would tilt her head slightly, her voice soft, almost sympathetic. It's completely normal, Lily. Little lapses happen, especially when you've been managing so much on your own. Little lapses. Such a harmless phrase, such a dangerous one. Because once that idea is planted that something is slipping, it doesn't stay small for long. Soon, every forgotten detail becomes proof. Every pause becomes evidence. Every moment of silence becomes suspicion. I began noticing how often they repeated things not because I had forgotten, but because they wanted to establish a pattern. Just to remind you, like I mentioned earlier, Remember we talked about this? At first I corrected them. I don't recall that conversation, I would say calmly. Ethan would smile, but there was something behind it. Well, we did. Maybe it just slipped your mind. And just like that, the truth became negotiable. Rachel took it a step further. She started offering help in ways that seemed thoughtful but felt invasive. I could organize your medications for you. I can set reminders on your phone. Let me take over your bill payments. It'll be one less thing for you to worry about. Each offer came wrapped in kindness. Each one carried an unspoken message. You can't handle this alone anymore. I declined politely at first. Oh, I've managed just fine so far, I would say with a smile. Rachel would nod, but I could see the faint tightening at the corners of her mouth. Patience. That's what she was exercising. Not kindness, patience. As if she believed that eventually I would give in not because I needed help, but because it would become easier than resisting. Ethan, meanwhile, started watching me more closely, not in the protective way he used to. In a different way, evaluating. I would catch him glancing at me when I spoke, as if measuring whether my words made sense. If I paused to think, his eyes would linger just a little longer than necessary. One evening, I set my keys down on the kitchen counter instead of the small bowl by the door where I usually kept them. A small thing, insignificant, but Ethan noticed. You don't usually leave them there, he said. I looked at him surprised. It's just for a moment. He nodded slowly but didn't say anything else. Rachel, however, did. That's exactly how it starts, she said gently. Starts, not happens, starts. As if I'd already begun a decline I hadn't even acknowledged. And suddenly, that small, meaningless action became something else entirely. A symptom, a warning sign, a piece of a story they were quietly building around me. I told myself again that I was imagining it, that I was reading too deeply into harmless concern. But then came the paperwork. Rachel brought it over one afternoon, tucked neatly into a leather folder. I was just updating some things for our own records, she said smoothly. Nothing urgent, just something we should all have in place. She placed the folder in front of me with practiced ease. Inside were documents, legal ones. Not overly complex, but structured in a way that made my chest tighten the moment I began reading. Authorization forms, Rachel explained, just in case we ever need to help you with anything. Medical decisions, finances, basic stuff. Basic. There was that word again. I flipped through the pages more carefully. Power of attorney language, access permissions. Clauses that extended far beyond just in case. I don't think I need this, I said, keeping my tone even. Ethan stepped in quickly. It's not about need, Mom. It's about being prepared. Prepared. For what? For the moment they decided I was no longer capable, I closed the folder and pushed it gently back toward Rachel. I appreciate the thought, I said. But I'm not comfortable signing anything like this right now. There was a brief silence. Not long, but long enough. Rachel's smile didn't disappear, but it changed. Just slightly. Well, she said, her voice still smooth. We can revisit it later. Revisit. As if this wasn't a question, as if it were an inevitability. Ethan didn't argue, but he didn't support me either, and that silence said more than anything he could have spoken. After that, things shifted again. Subtly but unmistakably, they became more careful around me, more measured, more deliberate. Conversations would stop when I entered the room, then resume in a different tone once I sat down. Rachel began taking phone calls in other rooms. Ethan checked his messages more frequently, stepping outside to respond. It wasn't obvious, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. Enough for that quiet awareness inside me to grow louder, until the day everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary in every possible way. I had just come back from the grocery store and was putting things away in the kitchen. Ethan had stopped by earlier that morning, said he needed to make a few calls before heading to work. His phone was on the counter. I didn't think anything of it at first, until it rang. I glanced at the screen out of habit. Rachel. I hesitated for a moment, then turned back to the groceries. It wasn't my call to answer, but then I heard his voice. From the living room, clear, unfiltered, because he had answered on speaker. Yeah, Ethan said, his tone different, flatter, sharper. There was a pause as Rachel spoke on the other end. I couldn't hear her words, but I heard his response. And those words changed everything. Just put her in a nursing home already, he said. We can't keep waiting forever. I froze, my hands still resting on the edge of the counter. The world didn't crash. There was no dramatic sound, no sudden shift in the air, just silence. And then the quiet realization that every doubt I had pushed aside, every instinct I had questioned, had been right. They weren't planning. They weren't preparing. They were waiting for the moment they could take control. And they were getting impatient. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't let him know I had heard a single word. Because in that moment, something inside me changed. Not into fear, not into anger, but into something far more dangerous, clarity. And for the first time, I stopped wondering if I was imagining things and started wondering just how far they were willing to go. I didn't confront him. That was the first decision I made, and in many ways the most important one. Because once you reveal what you know, you lose the advantage of observing what others don't realize you've seen. So I stayed quiet. That afternoon, I finished putting away the groceries as if nothing had happened. When Ethan stepped back into the kitchen a few minutes later, I greeted him the same way I always did. "Did you get everything done?" I asked lightly. He nodded, distracted, already reaching for his keys. "Yeah, just work stuff. I watched him for a moment, searching his face for something, guilt, hesitation, anything that might suggest he knew what he had just said. But there was nothing. No flicker of discomfort, no awareness at all. That told me more than his words ever could. This wasn't a moment of frustration. It wasn't a careless remark. It was normal to him, routine. And that meant whatever he and Rachel were planning. It wasn't new. After he left, the house felt different. Not unfamiliar, but exposed. Like I was seeing it for the first time through someone else's eyes. Not as a home, but as an asset, a structure. Something measurable, transferable, and most importantly, controllable. I stood in the middle of the living room for a long time, letting that realization settle into something solid. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out every document I could find, not out of panic, out of purpose. I started with the obvious, the filing cabinet in my office neatly organized, labeled in my own handwriting. Property deeds, tax records, insurance policies, investment summaries. Everything James and I had built was there, documented and accounted for. But this time, I wasn't reviewing it as the owner. I was reviewing it as someone trying to understand how another person might try to take control of it. And that shift in perspective changed everything. I noticed things I had never questioned before, access points, shared information, details that in the wrong hands could become leverage. I pulled out my bank statements and traced every account who had visibility, who had ever been listed, what permissions existed. Ethan had never had direct access. That had always been a boundary James and I agreed on, but he knew enough to ask the right questions, enough to guide someone else like Rachel toward the right doors. Next, I reviewed my property holdings, 3 rental properties, all fully in my name, no co-ownership, no transfer clauses. That was good. But then I remembered something, a conversation from a few months earlier. Ethan had asked casually, "Do you still have the original deed copies somewhere?" At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it. Now it lingered. Why would he need to know that I pulled the deeds from the file? They were all there, untouched. But the question itself meant something. It meant he was thinking about ownership, about documentation, about proof. I set the deeds aside and moved on. Next came my will. I hadn't updated it since shortly after James passed. It was straightforward. Everything divided cleanly. Nothing complicated, at least not on the surface. I read through it slowly, carefully, as if seeing it for the first time. And then I realized something that made my stomach tighten. It was predictable, completely. Anyone who read it could anticipate exactly how everything would be distributed. There were no protections against manipulation, no conditions, no safeguards, just trust. Trust that the people named would act with integrity, and suddenly that trust didn't feel like a strength. It felt like a vulnerability. I set the will aside and leaned back in my chair, thinking, not emotionally, strategically. If I were in their position, if I wanted to gain control, what would I do? I wouldn't try to take anything directly. That would be too obvious, too risky. No, I would go after the one thing that made everything else possible: decision-making authority. If they could prove or even suggest that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, then everything else would follow. Access, control, transfer. It would all happen legally, cleanly, and with the appearance of concern. That's when I remembered the paperwork Rachel had brought, the authorization forms. I stood up immediately and went to the drawer where I had placed the folder. I hadn't thrown it away. Something in me had told me to keep it. Now I knew why. I opened it again this time, reading every line with a different kind of focus. The language was subtle but precise. Medical decision authority, financial oversight permissions, emergency clauses that could be activated under specific conditions. Conditions that were open to interpretation. I felt a chill run through me. This wasn't casual. This wasn't something pulled from the internet or suggested in passing. This had been prepared, carefully, deliberately, and then I saw something that made everything click into place, a name, at the bottom of one of the pages. Not Rachel's, not Ethan's, an attorney. I recognized the firm immediately, a local elder care legal group, specializing in exactly the kind of cases I had just been imagining. I stared at that name for a long moment. Then I reached for my phone. Not to call them, but to search. Within minutes, I found what I needed: the firm's website, their services, guardianship petitions, capacity evaluations, legal pathways for transferring control when an individual is deemed unable to manage their own affairs. It was all there, clearly outlined, step by step. And suddenly, the pieces came together. Rachel hadn't just been asking questions. She had been gathering information. Ethan hadn't just been expressing concern. He had been participating. And the paperwork. It wasn't a suggestion. It was preparation. I sat back in my chair, my heart steady, my thoughts sharper than they had been in years. Because now I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't imagining. I knew. They were building a case. Not openly, not aggressively, but patiently, waiting for enough evidence to justify action, waiting for the moment they could say convincingly that I needed help, that I was no longer capable, that decisions had to be made for my own good. And once that door opened, it wouldn't close. I closed the folder slowly and placed it back on the desk. Then I stood up and walked through the house again, but this time I wasn't seeing it through their eyes. I was seeing it through my own with complete clarity. This was my life, my work, my independence, and if I did nothing, they would take it. Not with force, not with cruelty, but with paperwork, with signatures, with carefully constructed concern, and no one would question it, because on the surface, it would look like the right thing to do. I walked into the kitchen and rested my hands on the counter, the same place where I had stood when I heard Ethan's words. But I wasn't frozen this time. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even hurt in the way I had been before. I was focused, because now I understood something that changed everything. They thought they were ahead of me. They thought they had time. They thought I was unaware, and that was their mistake. Because while they were planning how to take control of my life, I was about to make sure there was nothing left for them to take. That night, I didn't sleep much, but not because I was afraid. Fear had already done its job. It had opened my eyes. What came after was something else entirely: clarity. And once you see things clearly, you don't panic. You plan. The first person I called the next morning was Grace Mitchell. If there is one person in this world who knows me without explanation, it's Grace. We've been friends for over 40 years through marriages, children, grief, and all the quiet changes that come with growing older. She's the kind of woman who doesn't interrupt, doesn't rush to fill silence, but when she speaks, you listen. She answered on the second ring. Lily, everything. Okay. I hesitated for only a moment before saying, no, I don't think it is. There was a pause, short but heavy with understanding. Do you want me to come over, she asked. No, I said. I think I need to come to you. An hour later, I was sitting at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. I told her everything. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just the facts. Ethan's words, the paperwork, the attorney's name, the pattern I could no longer ignore. Grace didn't interrupt once. She just listened. And when I finished, she leaned back slightly, her expression steady but her eyes sharper than I had seen in years. They're not just thinking about it, she said quietly. They're already in it. I nodded. I know. And you're sure I'm past being unsure? She exhaled slowly, then set her mug down. All right, she said. Then we don't treat this like a family conversation anymore. That sentence settled into me with a kind of weight I hadn't expected. Because she was right. This wasn't about hurt feelings. It wasn't about misunderstandings. It was about strategy. And strategy doesn't respond to emotion. It responds to action. I need to know what my options are, I said. Grace gave a small nod. Then you need a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. Someone who understands exactly what they're trying to do. I already have one, I replied. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Howard Bennett. A faint smile crossed her face. Good. Then you're not starting from behind. I left Grace's house with something I hadn't walked in with. Not comfort, not reassurance. Direction. By early afternoon, I was sitting across from Howard Bennett in his office downtown. Howard is the kind of man who doesn't waste words. Mid-60s, composed, observant, with a voice that stays even, no matter what you tell him. He had worked with James and me for years, estate planning investments, all the quiet decisions that shape a life over time. He knew me, which meant I didn't have to explain who I was before explaining what was happening. I laid everything out for him. The conversation I overheard, the documents Rachel brought, the attorney's name, the pattern. When I finished, he didn't speak immediately. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at me not with concern but with assessment. Finally, he said, You did the right thing by not confronting them. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So I'm not overreacting, I said. No, he replied. You're reacting at exactly the right time. There was something about the certainty in his voice that steadied me. What are they trying to do? I asked, even though I already knew. Howard leaned back slightly. They're positioning themselves, he said. Building a narrative. If they can establish that you're no longer fully capable of managing your affairs, they can petition for control, financial, medical, possibly even residential decisions. My jaw tightened. And the paperwork. An attempt to get you to agree voluntarily, he said. Much easier than going through the courts. And if I don't, then they continue building their case. He replied calmly. Observations, documentation, possibly even third-party evaluations. Evaluations. The word sent a quiet chill through me. They would need proof, I said. Howard nodded, or the appearance of it. These cases don't always hinge on hard evidence. They rely on patterns, what can be argued as concern. Concern. Always that word. So what do? I asked. He didn't hesitate. You remove their leverage? The simplicity of the statement almost caught me off guard. All of it, I asked. As much as possible, he said. Right now, their strategy depends on access, future access. Anticipated access, perceived entitlement to access. I understood immediately. If there's nothing left to control, they have no reason to pursue control, he finished. I sat back, letting that settle. And legally, I asked, Can I do that? Howard's expression didn't change. Lily, everything you own is yours, he said. You have full capacity, full authority. You can sell, transfer, donate, restructure, whatever you choose. And they can't stop me. Not if we act before they do, he replied. Before they do. Time. That was the one thing I had that they didn't realize. They think I don't know, I said quietly. Howard gave a small nod. Then that's your advantage. Silence filled the room for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just decisive, because in that silence I felt something shift inside me. Not doubt, not hesitation. Resolution. I don't want to just protect myself, I said slowly. I want to make sure they can't do this to anyone else either. Howard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in focus. That's a different level of strategy, he said. I know. And it will require more than just moving assets, he added. I'm prepared for that. He studied me for a moment, then gave a small, approving nod. All right, he said. Then we do this properly. For the next hour, we went through everything. Not emotionally, methodically, properties, accounts, legal structures, points of vulnerability, points of strength. Howard outlined options I hadn't even considered, ways to protect assets beyond simple transfers, ways to structure things so they couldn't be easily challenged, ways to ensure that even if someone tried to question my decisions, they would fail. You move quickly, he said, but you move carefully. I nodded, and one more thing he added. I looked at him. "Do not warn them," he said. "Do not hint, do not explain. The moment they realize what you're doing, they will try to accelerate their own actions." I understood. This wasn't a conversation. This was a race. And for the first time since I'd overheard Ethan's words, I felt something that surprised me. Not fear, not anger, control, because now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. And more importantly, I knew exactly what I was about to do. By the time I left Howard's office, the plan wasn't just an idea. It was in motion. And by the next morning, everything they thought they would one day inherit would already be slipping out of their reach. The next morning began earlier than usual. Not because I had somewhere to be, but because I had something to do. There's a quiet kind of power in waking up before the world does. The house was still the light, just beginning to soften the edges of the windows, and for the first time in days, my thoughts felt ordered. Not rushed, not scattered, clear. I made a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my notebook. Not a journal, a plan. At the top of the page, I wrote one sentence: remove all leverage. Everything that followed came from that. I started with the properties. 3 rentals, all fully owned, all generating steady income. For years, I had treated them as long-term security, something stable, something that would continue to support me no matter what happened. Now there was something else: targets. Assets that could be argued over, managed, transferred. I picked up the phone and called the real estate agent I trusted, someone I had worked with for over a decade. "Good morning, Lily," he said warmly. "What can I do for you? I need to list all 3 properties," I said. There was a brief pause. "All of them?" he asked. "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. "That's a big move," he said carefully. "Are you sure you don't want to stagger them, maximize value?" I looked down at the words on my notebook. "Remove all leverage. I'm not looking to maximize anything," I replied calmly. "I'm looking to move quickly." He didn't argue after that. He knew me well enough to understand when a decision had already been made. "All right," he said. "I'll start the process today. Thank you." When I hung up, I didn't feel hesitation, only momentum. Next came the accounts. This part required more precision. I logged into each one, reviewing balances, structures, access permissions. I wasn't just moving money. I was closing doors. I transferred liquid funds into newly structured accounts Howard had helped establish the day before, accounts with layers of protection designed to prevent unauthorized oversight or interference. Then I did something I had never done before. I began closing anything that could be interpreted as shared visibility, even indirect, even historical. If there was a thread that could be followed back to me, I cut it. Cleanly, completely. By mid-morning, the financial landscape of my life looked entirely different. Not smaller, not weaker, just untouchable. After that, I turned to the business. What remained of it anyway. My home decor business had long since been scaled down, but there were still materials inventory and a small storage space I kept out of habit, more than necessity. I drove there just after noon. The space looked exactly the same as it always had. Shelves lined with carefully packed boxes, tools I hadn't used in months. Pieces of work that once filled my days with purpose. I stood there for a moment, letting the memories settle. Then I reached for my phone. I called a local women's shelter I had supported quietly over the years. "This is Lily Thompson," I said. "I have supplies, furniture, decor materials. I'd like to donate everything." There was a brief pause on the other end. "That's incredibly generous," the woman said. "Are you sure?" I looked around the room one last time. "Yes," I replied, because I understood something now that I hadn't fully grasped before. Ownership isn't just about holding on. Sometimes it's about choosing where something belongs next. And I knew without question that this whatever was left of my business did not belong in the hands of people who saw it as something to claim. It belonged somewhere. It could still mean something. By late afternoon, I returned home. The house felt different. Not empty, not yet, but transitioning, like something in between what it had been and what it was about to become. I walked through each room slowly. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway where Ethan used to run as a child, his laughter echoing off the walls. For a moment, just a moment, I felt it. The weight of it all. Not regret, but recognition. Of what this place had been, of what it had meant, and of what it no longer was. Then I turned toward the final part of the plan, myself. Because removing leverage wasn't just about assets, it was about presence, location, accessibility. I went upstairs and opened my closet, not to pack everything, just what I needed. A few changes of clothes, important documents, personal items, nothing that could be argued over, nothing that could be used to anchor me to this place. By early evening, I had packed 2 small suitcases. That was all. 40 years of life reduced to what I could carry without effort. And strangely, it felt right. Because what mattered wasn't in the furniture, or the walls, or the things. It was in me. Always had been. I picked up my phone and called the leasing office Howard had recommended. A furnished apartment, short-term, under my maiden name. Not to hide, but to separate. To create distance between who I had been and who I needed to be now. Yes, the woman on the phone said. We have availability. I'll take it, I replied. No hesitation, no second guessing. Because by this point, I understood something clearly. This wasn't running away. This was stepping out of a space that no longer belonged to me in the way it once had. By the time the sun began to set, everything was in motion. Properties listed, accounts restructured, business donated, new residents secured, and yet, Ethan and Rachel knew nothing, not a single detail. To them, everything still looked the same. That was the most important part, because while they believed they were moving carefully, quietly, strategically, they had no idea that the ground beneath them had already begun to shift. I stood in the kitchen one last time that evening, the same place where I had overheard those words. Put her in a nursing home. I let the silence settle around me. Not heavy, not painful, just quiet. And then I realized something that surprised even me. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been, because anger requires attachment, and something inside me had already begun to let go. Not of my son, but of the version of him I had been holding on to. The version that would never have said those words, the version that no longer existed. I walked to the front door and looked out at the fading light. Tomorrow things would begin to change in ways they couldn't control, and soon they would realize something they never expected. They hadn't been planning my future. They had been planning around something that was already disappearing, and by the time they understood it fully, there would be nothing left for them to take. They came 3 days later. Not together at first, but within minutes of each other, as if whatever conversation had taken place between them on the way over had been carefully rehearsed. I knew the moment I saw Ethan's car pull into the driveway that something had shifted on their end. They had noticed. Maybe not everything, but enough. I was in the living room when he walked in, Rachel just behind him. I didn't stand to greet them this time. I didn't rush forward, didn't offer coffee, didn't fill the space with the small comforts I used to provide without thinking. I simply looked at them, and for the first time, I let them feel the distance. Ethan was the first to speak. Mom, what's going on? His voice wasn't calm. It wasn't angry yet either. It was something in between tight, uncertain, already leaning toward confrontation. I tilted my head slightly. What do you mean? Rachel stepped in before he could respond, her tone smooth, controlled. We've been trying to reach you, she said. The property manager called, and then the bank flagged some activity. We just wanted to make sure everything is all right. There it was. Concern. Always wrapped in concern. I'm fine, I replied simply. Ethan glanced past me into the house, his eyes moving quickly. That's when he noticed. The bookshelf, half empty. The side table by the window gone. The hallway felt wider because the console table that had been there for years was no longer in place. He took a step further inside. Why does the house look like this? He asked. I followed his gaze calmly. I've been making some changes. What kind of changes? He pressed. Necessary ones. Rachel's eyes sharpened slightly. What does that mean, Lily? She asked, her tone still polite but firmer now. I turned to look at her. It means, I said evenly, that I'm reorganizing my life. There was a pause, a brief one, but in that pause I saw it. The flicker of something breaking beneath their composure. Ethan stepped closer. Mom, did you list the properties? He asked. Direct, no pretense. I met his eyes. Yes. His jaw tightened immediately. All of them, yes. Why he demanded, not concern, not confusion, demand, and that told me everything I needed to know. I folded my hands lightly in front of me. Because they're mine, I said, and I decided it was time. "That's not what we talked about," he snapped. There it was again. I felt something almost like sadness pass through me, but it didn't stay. "We didn't talk about it," I corrected gently. "You talked about it." Rachel stepped forward, then her voice lowering slightly. "Lily, we're just trying to understand," she said. "This is a very sudden decision. These kinds of financial moves, they can have serious consequences if they're not handled properly." I almost smiled. Almost. "They are being handled properly," I replied. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the room. "You should have told us," he said. "We could have helped you think this through." I watched him carefully. "I did think it through," I said. With who, he shot back. There was a slight edge of panic now, not fully exposed, but close. "That's not something I need to explain," I answered calmly. Silence. Heavy this time. Rachel's posture shifted subtly, less soft, more rigid. "You're making major decisions without consulting your family," she said. "That's not like you. Not like you." As if she had authority to define who I was. "I'm still capable of making my own decisions," I said. Ethan stopped pacing. "Mom, no one is saying you're not capable," he said quickly. "But this is a lot all at once. It's not normal." Normal, such an interesting word. "Selling my own property isn't normal," I asked quietly. "That's not what I meant," he said, frustration rising. "You're doing everything at once." "It doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense to me." Rachel's voice cut in again, sharper now. "Lily, you have to understand how this looks," she said. "Rapid financial changes, isolation, secrecy." These are all signs that she stopped herself, but not quickly enough. That what I asked, my voice still calm. Ethan looked at her, then back at me. "Mom," he said softer now, trying a different approach. "We're just worried about you." There it was, the shift back to concern. But it was too late. I'd already seen what was underneath. "I'm not worried about me," I said. Ethan frowned. "Then what are you worried about?" I held his gaze for a long moment. Nothing, I replied, because the truth was, I wasn't worried anymore. Not about what they were planning, not about what they might try, because they were already too late. Rachel crossed her arms slightly, a small movement but telling. "You're shutting us out," she said. "I'm setting boundaries," I corrected. Ethan exhaled sharply. "This isn't you," he said. I tilted my head. "No," I said quietly, "it isn't." Another silence, but this one felt different. Not tense, final. Because in that moment, I realized something clearly. They weren't here to understand. They were here to assess, to evaluate how much control they still had. And when they didn't find it, they didn't know how to respond. Ethan looked around the room again, slower this time. "What else have you done?" he asked. There it was, the real question. Not why, not how, what else? I let a small pause pass before answering. "I've made arrangements," I said. "What kind of arrangements?" he pressed. I met his eyes, the kind that don't require your approval. His expression hardened. Rachel didn't speak this time. She didn't need to. I could see it in her face. Calculation, reassessment, they were adjusting, trying to understand what had already changed and what they might still be able to influence. But they were behind, and for the first time, they knew it. Ethan's voice lowered, quieter now, but more intense. "You're making a mistake," he said. I held his gaze steadily. "No," I replied. "I'm correcting one." He stared at me for a long moment, searching for something, uncertainty, hesitation, doubt. He didn't find it, because it wasn't there anymore. Finally, he stepped back, not in surrender, but in something close to it. "We need to talk about this," he said. I nodded once. "We just did." Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't over," she said. I looked at her calmly. "I know." And I did. Because this was only the beginning of them realizing that whatever they had been planning was no longer within their reach. And by the time they understood just how much had already changed, there would be nothing left for them to control at all. After they left that afternoon, the house felt quieter than it had in years. Not lonely, just clear, like a space that had finally stopped holding its breath. I didn't follow them to the door. I didn't try to soften what had just happened. I simply listened to the sound of Ethan's car pulling out of the driveway, the engine fading into the distance, and let the silence settle back into place. But silence doesn't mean stillness, because I knew they weren't done, not even close. People who are used to control don't walk away when it slips through their fingers. They regroup, they rethink, they try again. And sure enough, it didn't take long. That evening, my phone rang. Ethan. I let it go to voicemail. Not out of spite, but because I wanted to choose when and how I engaged next. A minute later, a message came through. "Mom, we need to talk. This isn't like you. Please call me." I read it once. Then again. Then I set the phone down. Not because I didn't care, but because I understood something now that I hadn't before. Urgency was no longer mine to carry. They were the ones running out of time. The next morning they came back, this time together, and this time prepared. I was in the kitchen when they walked in the early light filtering through the windows, soft but revealing. I had already been awake for hours reviewing documents, organizing what remained, moving through my plan with quiet precision. I didn't look surprised to see them, because I wasn't. Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mom, we need to have a serious conversation," he said, his tone controlled but strained. I turned slightly, resting one hand on the counter. I thought we already did. Rachel stepped forward, her voice smoother but colder than before. "No," she said. "Yesterday was confusion. Today is clarity. Clarity." I almost appreciated the honesty. "All right," I said. "Go ahead." Ethan took a breath as if steadying himself. "We've been thinking," he began, "about everything that's been happening, and we're concerned." There it was again. Concern. But now it sounded rehearsed. Not natural. Not instinctive. Strategic. Rachel continued seamlessly. "You've made several major financial decisions in a very short period of time," she said, "without consulting anyone, without any clear reasoning that we can understand." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "You don't need to understand my reasoning," I said. "That's exactly the problem," she replied. A pause. Then Ethan stepped in shifting tactics. "Mom," he said softer now, "this isn't about control. It's about making sure you're okay." I held his gaze. "And I've told you," I said calmly, "I am." Rachel's expression tightened slightly. But how do we know that she asked? The question hung in the air. Not innocent, not curious, calculated. I tilted my head. "You don't," I replied. Silence, heavy. Because that answer removed something they were counting on. Access. Rachel crossed her arms. "That's not how families work," she said. I let out a slow breath. "No," I said, "that's not how control works." Ethan's jaw clenched. "That's not fair," he snapped. "We're trying to help you." By planning to put me in a nursing home, I asked. The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were loud, but because they were precise. Ethan froze. Rachel's composure cracked just slightly. "What are you talking about?" she asked quickly. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on Ethan. "I heard you," I said quietly. Silence. This time it wasn't just heavy. It was exposed. Ethan's face changed not dramatically, but enough. A flicker of realization, of calculation, of something shifting behind his eyes. "That's not what you think," he said quickly. I didn't respond, because I had learned something important. When people rush to explain, they're not clarifying, they're adjusting. Rachel stepped in, her tone urgent now. "Lily, you must have misunderstood." "I didn't misunderstand," I said, cutting in calmly. Another silence. Longer, sharper. Ethan ran a hand over his face, pacing once across the kitchen. "It was just a conversation," he said. "We were talking about options." "Options you never discussed with me," I replied. "We were going to," he insisted when I asked. He didn't answer, because there was no answer that would make sense. Rachel shifted again, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is exactly why we're concerned," she said. "You're reacting emotionally to something that wasn't finalized." I turned to look at her fully now. "I'm not reacting emotionally," I said, and I meant it, because what I felt in that moment wasn't anger. It wasn't hurt. It was clarity. And clarity doesn't need volume. It just needs truth. Ethan stopped pacing. "Mom," he said, quieter now, "we're just trying to plan ahead. You're alone. Things can change quickly at your age." "My age," I repeated softly. He hesitated. "That's not what I meant," he said. But it was, and we both knew it. Rachel stepped closer, her voice lower, more deliberate. "Lily," she said, "we need to be realistic. You can't manage everything forever." I held her gaze. "I'm not trying to manage everything forever," I said. "Then why are you doing all of this?" she asked. Frustration finally breaking through. There it was, the real question. Not concern, not safety. Why are you removing our access? I let a small pause pass. Then I said, because I can. Ethan exhaled sharply. That's not a reason, he said. It's the only one I need. Silence again. But this time something shifted. Not in me, in them. Because for the first time, they weren't trying to guide the conversation. They were reacting to it. And that meant they were losing control. Ethan's voice dropped quieter, more intense. Do you have any idea how this looks? He asked. I met his eyes. Yes, I said. And you don't care, he pressed. I held his gaze for a moment longer. Then I said something I hadn't fully realized until that exact second. No, I replied, and it was true, because caring about how it looked would mean prioritizing their perspective over my reality, and I was done doing that. Rachel shook her head slightly. This isn't over, she said. I gave a small nod. I know, because I did. This wasn't the end. This was escalation. They had lost the subtle approach, the careful positioning. Now they would have to decide whether to push harder or step back. And based on everything I had seen so far, I already knew which one they would choose. As they turned to leave, Ethan paused at the doorway. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. Mom, we're going to figure this out, he said. Not a question, a statement, a warning almost. I looked at him steadily. No, I said, you're going to realize you already can't. He didn't respond because somewhere deep down, he was beginning to understand it too. Whatever they had been planning, whatever timeline they thought they were working within, had already been broken. And now, they were no longer in control of what happened next. The house was quieter after that. Not the kind of quiet that comes from absence, but the kind that comes from clarity. Every room felt sharper, more defined, as if the air itself had been stripped of illusion. I didn't rush into the next step. For the first time since everything began, I allowed myself a pause. Not because I was unsure, but because I needed to understand something that had been sitting just beneath the surface of all of this, James. My husband had always been a careful man, not suspicious, but aware. The kind of person who didn't assume things would go wrong, but made sure there was a plan in case they did. After he passed, I had gone through most of our shared documents, accounts, insurance wills. Everything had been in order, as I expected. But grief has a way of narrowing your focus. You see what you need to survive the moment, not always what might matter later. That afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the old cedar chest at the foot of our bed. It had been years since I'd opened it. Inside were things I hadn't had the heart or the reason to revisit. Old letters, photographs, documents James had set aside separately from our main files. I knelt down slowly and lifted the lid. The scent of aged wood and paper rose faintly familiar in a way that tightened something in my chest. For a moment, I simply looked at the life we had built, at the memories stored in fragments. Then I reached in, carefully, deliberately. I wasn't searching randomly. I was following a feeling, a memory that hadn't fully formed until now. James had said something to me once, years before he died. We had been sitting at this very bed going over some paperwork late in the evening. I remember being tired, ready to finish, when he paused and looked at me with that quiet seriousness he only used when something truly mattered. If anything ever feels off, he had said, don't assume it's nothing. At the time, I had laughed it off. You worry too much, I told him. He smiled, but not dismissively. Maybe he said, but I'd rather prepare for something that never happens than ignore something that does. I hadn't thought about that conversation in years, until now. My hand moved through the contents of the chest, past old photographs, past letters tied with ribbon until my fingers brushed against a thick envelope, plain, unmarked, except for one thing, my name. In James's handwriting. I froze, not out of fear, but recognition. Slowly, I pulled it out. It was heavier than I expected. Inside, there were multiple documents and a letter. I sat down on the edge of the bed before opening it. For a moment, I simply held it in my hands, because I knew before I even read a single word that whatever was inside, it mattered. I unfolded the letter carefully, and as my eyes moved across the page, the room seemed to fall away. Lily. If you're reading this, it means something does someone feel right, and you finally trusted that instinct. I felt my breath catch. Not because I was surprised, but because he had known. not what would happen, but that something could. I continued reading. I hope this letter is unnecessary. Truly I do. But if it's not, then I need you to understand something very clearly. Not everyone who smiles at you has your best interest at heart, and not every threat comes in the form of conflict. Sometimes it comes quietly through concern, through suggestions, through the slow erosion of your authority over your own life. My hands tightened slightly around the paper, because that was exactly what had been happening. Word for word, I've made certain arrangements, legal ones, that you may not remember in detail. I didn't want to burden you with them unless they were needed. I blinked, my mind already racing. Arrangements. If anyone ever attempts to gain control over you, your decisions, your assets, your independence, there are protections in place, but they only activate under specific conditions. My heart began to beat faster. If coercion, manipulation, or attempts to declare you unfit are documented, then access to the majority of our shared estate is automatically restricted, not to punish, but to protect. I lowered the letter slightly, my thoughts aligning with sudden, startling clarity. James hadn't just planned for death. He had planned for this, for the possibility that anyone might try to take advantage of what we had built. I looked back down at the page. Lily, I trust you. Always have. You are more capable than anyone will ever give you credit for, but capability doesn't stop people from trying. If that day ever comes, don't hesitate, act. Protect yourself first. Everything else can be figured out later. I felt something shift inside me then. Not just understanding, validation, because everything I had done, the decisions, the speed, the silence, it wasn't just instinct. It was aligned with something James had already prepared for. I turned to the rest of the documents inside the envelope. Legal papers, detailed, structured, specific. I read through them carefully, my mind absorbing each clause, each condition. And then I saw it, the core of it all. A protective clause embedded within our estate structure, one that I had either overlooked or not fully understood at the time. If any attempt was made to establish control over me through claims of incapacity, if there was evidence of manipulation or coercion, then the majority of our assets Ethan believed were part of his future inheritance would become inaccessible, not transferred, not seized, locked, redirected under controlled legal structures that required independent oversight. In simple terms, the moment they tried to take control, they would lose it completely. I sat there for a long time after that, not moving, not reacting outwardly, but inside, everything was aligning, because now I understood something they didn't. They weren't just late, they were walking directly into a system designed to stop them, and they had no idea it existed. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, not out of sentiment, out of respect, for James, for what he had done, for what he had seen before I ever did. Then I stood up, walked to my desk, and placed the envelope beside the rest of my documents. Because now, this wasn't just about removing leverage, it was about revealing truth. And the truth was this: they believed they were planning my future, but in reality, they were about to trigger consequences they couldn't even imagine. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be me who lost control. It would be them. They didn't wait long to make their next move. 3 days after my discovery in the cedar chest, just as the final paperwork for the property listings had begun moving forward, I heard a knock at my front door. Firm, official. Not the hesitant knock of a neighbor, not the familiar rhythm of Ethan. I already knew, before I even stood up, before I even walked across the room, because once subtle control fails, it rarely disappears, it escalates. I opened the door to find 2 people standing side by side, a uniformed officer, and a woman in her mid-40s holding a clipboard, her expression neutral but practiced. "Mrs. Thompson," she asked. "Yes, my name is Karen Wells. I'm with Adult Protective Services. We received a report requesting a wellness check." There it was, formal, documented, exactly the kind of move Howard had warned me about. I didn't react, not outwardly. "Of course," I said calmly. "Please come in." They stepped inside, their eyes moving subtly through the house, not intrusively but observantly, assessing, always assessing. I closed the door behind them. "Is everything all right today?" Karen asked, her tone measured, professional. Yes, I replied. Everything is exactly as it should be. She nodded slightly, making a note on her clipboard. We just need to ask you a few questions, she said. Standard procedure, of course. We sat in the living room, or rather, what remained of it. The partially cleared space worked in my favor more than I expected. It didn't look chaotic, it looked intentional, deliberate. Karen glanced around briefly before focusing back on me. Have you made any recent changes to your living situation or finances, she asked. Yes. Can you tell me about those changes? I've chosen to sell several properties, reorganize my financial accounts, and transition to a different living arrangement, I said evenly. Her pen paused for a moment. And what prompted these decisions? A personal reassessment of my long-term plans, I replied. She studied me for a second longer. Not suspicious, just attentive. Have you been feeling confused, overwhelmed, or pressured by anyone in your life, she asked. There it was, the question beneath all the others. I held her gaze steadily. No. Has anyone suggested that you may no longer be able to manage your own affairs? She continued. I allowed a small pause. Then I said yes. Her pen moved quickly. And who made that suggestion? My son and his wife. The room shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough. Because now the direction of the conversation had changed. Karen glanced briefly at the officer, then back at me. Can you elaborate on that? She asked. They have expressed concern about my independence, I said calmly. They have also attempted to introduce legal documents that would grant them authority over my medical and financial decisions. Karen's expression remained neutral, but I saw it, the shift in her attention. What kind of documents? She asked. Power of attorney forms, I replied, presented without prior discussion and with language that extended beyond what was described to me verbally. She made another note. And did you sign these documents? No. Did you feel pressured to? Yes. Another pause. Then she set her pen down. Mrs. Thompson, she said carefully, we received a report indicating that there were concerns about your mental clarity and your ability to manage your finances responsibly. I almost smiled. Almost. I'm aware, I said. And how would you respond to that concern? I would say I replied that my decisions are intentional, legally sound, and fully within my rights. Karen nodded slowly. Do you have documentation supporting that? She asked. I do. I stood up calmly and walked to my desk, retrieving a folder I had prepared the night before. Not out of fear. Out of readiness. I handed it to her. Inside were recent financial transaction summaries, documentation of property listings, statements from my physician confirming my mental capacity, legal notes from Howard outlining the legitimacy of my actions. Karen reviewed the contents carefully, not quickly, not dismissively, thoroughly. The officer remained silent the entire time, his presence steady but unobtrusive. Finally, Karen looked up. Everything here appears to be in order, she said. I expected it would, I replied. There was a brief moment where she seemed to consider something further. Then she asked, Are you currently under the care of any physician for cognitive concerns? No. And have you experienced any recent memory issues or disorientation? No. She nodded again. Then she closed the folder and handed it back to me. Based on what I've seen today, she said there are no grounds for further action at this time. The words landed quietly, but they carried weight. Because this had been their move, and it had failed, completely. Karen stood up. However, she added, I would recommend documenting any further interactions with your family, especially if you feel pressured or uncomfortable. I met her gaze. I intend to. She gave a small, understanding nod. Then she and the officer made their way toward the door. I walked with them, opening it as they stepped outside. Thank you for your cooperation, she said. Thank you for your professionalism, I replied. And I meant it, because in a different situation, this visit could have gone very differently. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and for a moment I simply stood there, still, silent. Then I exhaled, not in relief, but in confirmation. Because now, there was no doubt. Ethan and Rachel hadn't just been planning. They had acted. They had made the report. They had attempted to initiate the process. And they had done it believing they were ahead. But they weren't. Not anymore. I walked back into the living room, setting the folder down on the table. Then I picked up my phone. Not to call them, not yet, but to save something. A recording from the day before, our conversation. Ethan's words, Rachel's tone, everything. Because now this wasn't just about defense, it was about evidence. And evidence changes everything. I sat down slowly, letting the quiet return, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. This one carried something new, momentum, because they had taken their step, and it had failed, which meant there was only one direction left for this to go: forward, toward the moment when everything they had tried to build would collapse under the weight of its own intent. And when that moment came, I would be ready, not to fight, but to reveal. I didn't call Ethan after the visit from Adult Protective Services. I didn't need to, because something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Not just in what had happened, but in what it revealed. This wasn't concern anymore. It wasn't even strategy in the careful sense they had tried to maintain before. It was desperation, and desperation doesn't hide itself very well. That evening, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, my phone rang again. Ethan. This time I answered. Hello. There was a pause on the other end, short but loaded. Mom, he said finally. We need to talk. His voice sounded different, not controlled, not rehearsed, strained. I'm listening, I replied. No, he said quickly, not like this, in person. I considered it for a moment. Then I said, all right, come over. He arrived alone. That was the first surprise. No Rachel, no careful coordination, just Ethan. And the moment he stepped inside, I could see it. Whatever composure he had been holding on to was slipping. He didn't sit right away. He stood in the middle of the living room looking around, not at the space, but at what it represented now. Change, loss, something he hadn't anticipated. Did you call them? I asked calmly. He looked at me. What Adult Protective Services, I said. Did you make the report? He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. We were worried, he said. Even now. I nodded slowly. I see. That's not... He started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. It's not what you think. I didn't respond, because I had learned something important. When people repeat that sentence, it usually means it's exactly what you think. Ethan exhaled sharply and finally sat down, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. Everything is getting out of control, he said. I tilted my head slightly. For who? His eyes snapped up to mine. For all of us, he said. I held his gaze. Not for me, I replied. Silence. He looked away first. That too told me something. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice quieter now. Why are you shutting us out? I studied him for a moment before answering. I'm not shutting you out, I said. I'm protecting myself. His expression tightened. From us, yes. The word landed between us, heavy and undeniable. Ethan let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. That's insane, he said. Is it? I asked calmly. He didn't answer, because somewhere beneath everything else, he knew. I'm your son, he said instead. I would never hurt you. I watched him carefully. Not for the words, for what was behind them. Then why did you try to take control of my life without my consent? I asked. He flinched slightly, not dramatically, but enough. That's not what we were doing, he said. Then what were you doing? We were trying to help, he insisted. I leaned back slightly. Help me do what I asked. He hesitated again, and in that hesitation, the truth began to surface. Help you. Manage things, he said finally. Manage what I pressed, your finances, your living situation, everything, I repeated softly. And there it was. Not partial, not supportive, everything. I let a small silence settle before speaking again, and when exactly was I going to stop being part of those decisions, I asked. His jaw tightened. That's not fair, he said. No, I replied, it's not. Another silence, this one longer, more uncomfortable, because now we weren't circling the issue anymore. We were inside it. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his hands together, his frustration building. You don't understand what's been happening, he said. I raised an eyebrow slightly. Then explain it to me. He hesitated. Then for the first time, something cracked, not completely, but enough. Things haven't been stable, he said. Financially, I added. He looked at me surprised. How did you? It's not hard to see, I said. He let out a breath, looking down at the floor. It's more than that, he admitted. I didn't interrupt. I just waited. Because now, he was no longer performing. He was revealing. There were some investments, he said slowly. They didn't go the way I expected. How bad, I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Bad enough." I nodded once. "And Rachel," I asked. He hesitated. "She knows," he said. "Of course she did. And the debts," I continued. His head lifted slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You've been digging," he said. "I've been paying attention," I corrected. Another silence. Then he exhaled, leaning back in his chair, defeated in a way I hadn't seen before. "It's not just one thing," he said. "It's everything. Business loans, credit. Trying to keep up with expectations. Expectations." I almost asked whose, but I already knew. "Rachel," I said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the truth was sitting right there in the space between us. This hadn't started with Rachel, but she had amplified it, given it direction, given it urgency, and your solution, I said slowly, was to take control of my assets. "That's not how I saw it," he said quickly. "How did you see it?" He hesitated again, then quietly. "As securing our future. Our, not mine, not yours, ours." I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger, not even sadness, just understanding. Clear and complete. "You weren't securing anything," I said softly. "You were taking." He flinched. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he said. I believed that I replied, and I did. Because harm doesn't always come from intention. Sometimes it comes from entitlement, from justification, from the belief that something belongs to you, simply because you want it to. Ethan looked at me, his expression raw now. "So what happens now?" he asked. I held his gaze steadily. "Now," I said, "you face the consequences of your choices." His jaw tightened. "You're really going to do this?" he asked. "I already have." Silence. Final this time. Because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to reinterpret. The truth was fully visible now, and for the first time, he couldn't reshape it into something else. He stood up slowly, not angry, not defensive, just exposed. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said. I looked at him. "That's because you never thought I would see it coming." He didn't argue, because he knew it was true. And as he turned to leave, I realized something that brought everything into focus. This wasn't the moment he changed. It was the moment I finally saw him clearly, not as the boy I raised, but as the man he had become. And now, there was no going back. After Ethan left that night, I didn't follow him to the door. I stayed where I was sitting in the quiet of the living room, listening to the faint echo of his footsteps fading down the driveway. There was no dramatic ending to that conversation. No raised voices. No final declarations. Just truth. And sometimes, that's heavier than anything else. I sat there for a long time, letting everything he had said settle into something solid. Not because I needed to process it emotionally, but because I needed to understand it completely. There's a difference. Emotion asks why this happened to me. Clarity asks what this actually is, and what this was not sudden. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't even entirely malicious. It was something far more dangerous. It was gradual, built over time, layer by layer, decision by decision, until eventually it didn't feel like wrongdoing to him anymore. It felt like justification. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not out of restlessness, but out of purpose. Because now I had something I hadn't had before, the full picture, and once you have that, you stop reacting, you start finalizing. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, spreading out the documents Howard and I had prepared, along with the letter James had left behind. For the first time, I laid everything side by side. What I had built, what they had planned, what James had protected, and what Ethan had just confirmed. Debt. Not small, not temporary. Systemic. I began writing. Not notes, not thoughts, a timeline, because I wanted to see it clearly. When the financial questions began, when the concern started shifting tone, when Rachel entered the picture, when the urgency increased, and finally, when the plan moved from discussion to action, it was all there, not scattered, connected, logical. And once I saw it laid out that way, the final piece fell into place. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about timing. They weren't waiting for the future. They were racing against collapse. That's why everything had accelerated. The paperwork, the pressure, the wellness check. It wasn't patience anymore. It was desperation. And desperation makes people reckless. I looked down at the timeline again, my pen resting lightly against the paper. Then I added one more line. Realtor inquiry, future sale discussion. Because I remembered something. A detail that hadn't fully registered until now. During one of Rachel's earlier visits, she had mentioned casually, almost offhand, "This house has great resale potential, Lily, especially in this market." At the time, I had smiled politely. Now I understood what that comment really was, not observation, projection. So I did something simple. I made a call. The realtor I had worked with for years answered quickly. "Lily, good morning. Everything moving smoothly on your listings. I'm glad to hear it," I said. "I have a question." "Of course. Has anyone contacted you recently about my property?" I asked. There was a pause. Then, "What do you mean?" Before I listed it, I clarified. "Any inquiries, any early discussions?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then his tone shifted slightly. "Actually, yes," he said, "now that you mention it." I felt my grip on the phone tighten slightly. "Who a woman," he said. "About 2 months ago. Asked general questions, valuation, market timing, potential listing strategies." My chest went still. "Did she give a name?" "Yes," he said. And when he said it, there was no surprise. "Rachel Thompson." "Of course." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Not out of shock, out of confirmation. "Did she say why she was asking?" I asked. "She said she was helping a family member plan ahead," he replied. "Nothing unusual at the time. No, not unusual. Just early. Calculated." I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat there, the phone still in my hand, letting that final piece settle into place. Because now, there was nothing left unclear. Rachel hadn't just been reacting. She had been planning, long before Ethan admitted anything, long before the pressure began. And Ethan, he hadn't been led into it. He had joined it, willingly. That realization didn't break me. It didn't even anger me. Because by this point, emotion wasn't driving anything anymore. Truth was, and the truth was simple. They hadn't been trying to help me. They had been preparing to replace me. As decision maker, as owner, as the one in control of everything I had built. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The world outside hadn't changed. Cars passed. Neighbors walked their dogs. Life continued indifferent to the quiet unraveling of what I had once believed was unshakable. And in that moment, I felt something settle inside me. Not heavy, not painful, just final. Because now there was nothing left to question, nothing left to uncover. Everything was visible, which meant everything that came next would not be reaction. It would be conclusion. I turned away from the window and walked back to the table, picked up my pen, and wrote one final line beneath everything else. No more access, no more influence, no more control. Then I closed the notebook, because the decision was complete. Not just in action, but in certainty. From this point forward, nothing I did would be about protecting what they might take. It would be about defining what they would never touch again. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt something that had nothing to do with strategy, nothing to do with planning. Peace. Because clarity doesn't just show you the truth. It frees you from needing anything else. I didn't rush the final step, not because I needed more time, but because timing now mattered in a different way. Everything that needed to be done behind the scenes had already been done. The properties were under contract. The accounts had been restructured. The protections James had put in place were not only intact, but ready. And Ethan and Rachel. They were no longer planning. They were reacting. Which meant it was time to bring everything into the open. I asked Howard to arrange a formal meeting. Not at my house, not at theirs. At his office. Neutral ground, controlled, documented. Everyone present. No room for interpretation, no space for manipulation. Ethan agreed almost immediately. That told me something. He thought this was still negotiable. Rachel didn't respond directly, but she would come. I knew she would, because people who operate through control rarely walk away from the chance to regain it. The meeting was set for Friday morning, 10:00 a.m. I arrived early, not out of anxiety, out of intention. Howard greeted me with a small nod as I entered, already prepared, already aware of what this meeting represented. "Everything is ready," he said. I nodded once. Good. The conference room was quiet, minimal, a long table, 4 chairs on one side, 2 on the other, deliberate positioning. I chose my seat carefully, not at the head of the table, but not at the end either, centered, balanced, because this wasn't about dominance, it was about clarity. Ethan and Rachel arrived together, right on time. Rachel walked in first, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral. Ethan followed just behind her, less controlled, more tense. They both stopped briefly when they saw me already seated. Prepared, waiting. Rachel recovered first. "Lily," she said smoothly, taking her seat across from me. "Rachel." Ethan sat beside her, his movements less precise. "Mommy said." I didn't respond immediately, not out of coldness, but because I wanted the silence to settle. Howard entered a moment later, closing the door behind him. "Thank you all for coming," he said, taking his place beside me. There were no pleasantries, no small talk, because none of that belonged in this room. Howard opened a folder and placed several documents on the table. "We're here to clarify the current situation regarding Mrs. Thompson's assets, estate structure, and recent concerns raised by her family," he said. Rachel's expression remained composed, but her eyes moved quickly to the documents, assessing. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "This didn't have to be this formal," he said. "Yes," I replied calmly. "It did." Silence. Howard continued. "Before we proceed, I want to make one thing clear," he said. "Mrs. Thompson has been fully evaluated and confirmed to have complete mental and legal capacity." He slid a document forward. "Medical verification." Rachel's jaw tightened slightly. Ethan didn't move. Additionally, Howard continued, "All recent financial actions taken by Mrs. Thompson have been reviewed and confirmed as intentional, lawful, and within her sole authority." Another document, another shift in the room. Rachel spoke first. "We never said she wasn't capable," she said smoothly. Howard didn't look at her. "You initiated a wellness check," he replied. A pause. Rachel didn't respond, because there was nothing to say. Howard turned to me slightly. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "would you like to proceed?" I nodded, then I reached forward and placed a small device on the table. A recorder. Simple. Visible. Ethan's eyes flicked to it immediately. Rachel's expression didn't change, but her posture did. Subtly. Tighter. "I'd like to begin with this," I said. Then I pressed play. Ethan's voice filled the room. Clear. Undeniable. "Just put her in a nursing home already. We can't keep waiting forever." Silence followed. Not immediate, because the weight of those words needed a moment to land. Rachel didn't move. Ethan's face drained of color. "That's," he started. I raised a hand slightly, and he stopped, because for the first time, he understood. This wasn't a conversation he could steer. I turned off the recording, then I spoke. "You were waiting," I said quietly. Not accusing, not emotional, just stating the truth. Ethan looked down. Rachel remained still. Howard stepped in. Based on documented evidence of coercive intent, he said, "We are now proceeding under protective clauses established within the Thompson estate." Rachel's head turned sharply. "What does that mean?" she asked. Howard slid another document forward. "This means," he said, "that any attempt to establish control over Mrs. Thompson's assets through claims of incapacity triggers automatic restriction of access to the majority of those assets." Ethan's head lifted. What he said. Howard didn't pause. "The properties have been sold," he continued. "The liquid assets have been transferred into protected structures. The remaining holdings are now under a foundation entity established in Mr. James Thompson's name." Rachel's composure broke. "Foundation," she said. "What foundation?" I spoke this time. "One that supports individuals in situations exactly like this," I said. Silence. Heavy. Final. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from confusion to realization. "You moved everything he said, yes. You didn't tell us." "No." Rachel's voice cut in sharper now. "You can't just—" "I can," I said calmly, and that was the end of that argument, because legally, there was nothing left to challenge. Howard placed one final document on the table. "There is one remaining provision," he said. Ethan looked at him. A limited trust, Howard continued. "Modest in size, conditional in access." Rachel leaned forward slightly. "What conditions?" Howard didn't look at her. "Financial accountability," he said. "Demonstrated repayment of existing debts and a complete relinquishment of any attempt to control Mrs. Thompson's personal or financial decisions." Ethan stared at the document, silent. Rachel's voice dropped colder than before. "This is punishment," she said. I shook my head slightly. "No," I replied. "It's a boundary." She looked at me, her expression tight. "You're destroying your own family," she said. I held her gaze. No, I said quietly. You already tried to do that. Silence. No one moved. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reinterpret. Everything was visible now. Clear, documented, final. Ethan stood slowly, not in anger, not in defiance, but in something else entirely. Collapse. This wasn't supposed to happen like this, he said. I looked at him. That's because you were planning for a version of me that doesn't exist. He didn't respond because he couldn't. Rachel remained seated, her eyes still sharp but her position gone. Because control requires access, and access was no longer hers. Howard closed the folder. This concludes the matter, he said, and just like that, it was over. Not emotionally, not personally, but legally, completely. As Ethan and Rachel left the room, I didn't follow. I didn't speak. I simply sat there, still, calm, certain, because this wasn't a victory, not in the way people imagine. It wasn't about winning. It was about ending something that should have never begun. And finally, that had been done. The silence after the meeting lingered longer than I expected. Not in the room itself, that cleared quickly enough once Ethan and Rachel walked out, but inside me, because endings, even necessary ones, don't arrive with celebration. They arrive with weight. I didn't leave Howard's office right away. I sat there for a few extra minutes, my hands resting lightly on the table, letting everything that had just happened settle into something real. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just final. Howard closed the last folder and looked at me. You handled that well, he said. I gave a small nod. It needed to be done. Yes, he replied. It did. There was a pause. Then he added, what happens next is up to you. I understood what he meant. Legally, everything was resolved, but life doesn't end at legal resolution. It continues. And what I chose to do with that continuation, that was mine. I've already decided, I said quietly. He didn't ask what. He didn't need to, because he knew me well enough to understand that once I reached clarity, I didn't waver. I left his office shortly after. The air outside felt different, lighter, not because something had been gained, but because something had been released. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about what might happen next, because there was no might left. Everything had already unfolded, but of course, that didn't mean it was over for them. 3 days later, Ethan called again. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, something quieter, more settled, told me that I should. Hello. There was a long pause on the other end, longer than any of our previous conversations. Then finally, Mom, his voice sounded different, not sharp, not defensive, not rehearsed, tired. I need to talk to you, he said. I didn't respond immediately, not because I was hesitant, but because I was listening, not to his words, to what was behind them. About what I asked. Another pause. Then everything. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again. You can come by, I said. He arrived alone again. And this time, he didn't look like the same man who had walked into Howard's office. There was no tension in his posture, no urgency in his movements, just heaviness. He stepped inside, slowly glancing around the house, not searching, not assessing, just noticing. What's left of it, he said quietly. I didn't answer, because there was nothing to add. We sat across from each other in the living room. The space between us felt different now, not charged, not confrontational, just honest. Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped together. I lost everything he said. There was no hesitation, no attempt to soften it, just truth. I held his gaze. I know I replied. He nodded once, looking down at his hands. The business is gone, he continued. The accounts overdrawn, the loans he stopped exhaling, it all collapsed. I didn't interrupt, because this wasn't about explanation, it was about acknowledgement. And Rachel, I asked. His jaw tightened slightly. She left, he said. The words were simple, but they carried more than he said out loud. When I asked, the day after the meeting, he replied, packed her things, said she wasn't staying to clean up a mess that wasn't hers. I let that settle, because in a way, she wasn't wrong, but she also wasn't innocent. She was part of it, I said quietly. He nodded. I know. Another silence. But this one wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective, because for the first time, we weren't arguing, we weren't defending, we were just speaking. I didn't see it clearly, he said after a moment. I tilted my head slightly. Didn't you? He looked up at me. I saw parts of it, he admitted, but I kept telling myself it was temporary, that once things stabilized, I'd fix everything. And in the meantime, I asked. He didn't answer, because he didn't need to. We both knew. In the meantime, I said softly, "You were willing to take control of my life." He flinched, not physically, but internally. I thought. He began, then stopped. What I asked. I thought it made sense, he said finally. You had more than enough. I was struggling. It felt like a solution. A solution. I let that word sit between us. Then I said, at my expense. He closed his eyes briefly. Yes, the honesty surprised me. Not because I didn't expect it, but because it had taken this long to arrive. And now I asked. He looked at me again. I don't have anything left to justify, he said. That was the closest thing to accountability he had offered so far. And for the first time, it felt real. I leaned back slightly. There's still the trust, I said. His expression shifted just slightly. I know he replied. Do you understand the conditions, I asked. Yes. And he hesitated. Then I don't know if I can meet them. The words were quiet, but honest. Why not, I asked. He let out a small, hollow laugh. Because it means starting over, he said. Completely. No shortcuts, no safety net. I held his gaze. That's exactly what it means. Another silence. Then he nodded. I figured. He sat back, running a hand over his face. I didn't come here to ask for money, he said. I know. I came here to... He paused, searching for the words. To say that I understand now. I watched him carefully. Understand what I asked. That I crossed a line, he said. That I stopped seeing you as my mother and started seeing you as something else. An asset, I said. He swallowed. Yes. The word hung in the air. Heavy. Unavoidable. And I can't undo that, he added. No, I said, you can't. Another pause. Then he stood up slowly. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. I'm not thinking about forgiveness, I replied. He nodded. That makes sense. He turned toward the door, then stopped. Is there any chance, he asked? I considered the question carefully. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but honestly. Yes, I said. He turned back, surprised. But not now, I added, and not easily. He nodded again. I understand. And this time, I believed him. Because understanding doesn't come from words. It comes from consequences, and he was finally living in them. As he walked out the door, I didn't stop him. I didn't call after him. I simply watched him leave, not as the boy I once raised, not even as the man he had become, but as someone standing at the beginning of something he had never truly faced before, responsibility. And whether he chose to carry it, that was no longer something I could control, nor something I needed to. The first morning in my new apartment was quieter than I expected. Not empty, not lonely, just still. The kind of stillness that doesn't press against you, but instead gives you space to breathe. I stood by the window with a cup of coffee in my hands, watching the early light stretch across a part of the city I had never really noticed before. It wasn't far from my old home, just a few miles, but it felt like a different world entirely. Smaller, simpler, honest. There were no echoes of the past here. No rooms filled with memories. No furniture that carried the weight of decades. Just what I had chosen to bring, and what I had chosen to leave behind for the first time in a long time. Everything around me belonged fully to the present. The transition hadn't been dramatic, no grand moment, no emotional breakdown, just a series of quiet steps, one decision at a time. I had sold the house 2 weeks after the meeting, quickly, cleanly, without hesitation. Some people might have expected me to feel something stronger when I handed over the keys, but I didn't. Because by that point, that house was no longer what it had once been. It wasn't the place James and I had built together. That version of it existed only in memory, and I had already carried those memories with me. Everything else was just structure. The foundation, James Thompson Foundation, was officially active now, not large, not publicized, but real and purposeful. Grace had been by my side through every step of setting it up. She handled the parts that required patience and persistence, while I focused on what mattered most. Who it was for, women like me. Not identical in circumstance, but similar in vulnerability. Women who had spent their lives building something families' homes stability only to find themselves slowly pushed aside when others decided they were no longer necessary, or worse, no longer capable. The first outreach event was small, just a handful of attendees, a quiet room in a community center, coffee simple chairs, no formal structure, and yet it mattered. Because when one woman stood up and said, "I thought I was the only one this was happening to," I knew this wasn't just something I had survived. It was something I could help others navigate. That realization didn't feel like redemption. It felt like purpose. Grace leaned toward me that afternoon, her voice low. "You turned something ugly into something meaningful," she said. I shook my head slightly. "I just refused to let it end badly," I replied. She smiled. "That too. Ethan didn't come around again after that last visit. Not in person, but about a month later, a letter arrived, handwritten, simple. No return address. I knew it was from him the moment I saw the envelope. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the table for a full day. Not out of hesitation, but out of intention. Because I wanted to read it without expectation, without emotion guiding the outcome. When I finally opened it, the words were different from anything he had said before. No justifications, no explanations, no attempts to reshape the past, just acknowledgement. He wrote about the debts, about the pressure, about how easy it had been to convince himself that what he was doing made sense. And then he wrote something that stayed with me. "I didn't realize I had already lost you long before you walked away. I stopped seeing you clearly, and now I'm trying to understand what that cost me." There was no request in the letter, no mention of the trust, no question about the future, just that, understanding, or at least the beginning of it. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not hidden, not displayed, just kept. Because some things don't need immediate answers. They need time. And I was no longer in a place where I needed to rush anything. My days settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first, but quickly became something I valued. Mornings with coffee by the window, afternoons spent working on foundation outreach, meeting with women who needed guidance or simply someone to listen. Evenings that were quiet but not empty, peaceful. Grace visited often. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. And that was enough. One evening, as we sat together watching the sky shift into soft shades of orange and gray, she turned to me. "Do you ever wish it had gone differently?" she asked. I thought about that. Not quickly, not defensively, just honestly. "Yes," I said. She nodded, waiting. "I wish he had come to me," I continued. "Before everything, before the decisions, before the plan." "And if he had," she asked. I looked out at the fading light. "I would have helped him," I said. There was no hesitation in that answer. Because it was true. Not because he deserved it, but because I would have chosen it. That was the difference. Choice. Grace exhaled softly. "That's what makes this so hard," she said. I nodded. Yes. Because betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people you would have given everything to, if they had only asked. But they didn't. And that changed everything. A few weeks later, I stood in front of a small group again, different faces, this time different stories, but the same quiet thread connecting them. Fear, confusion, doubt. I looked at them for a moment before speaking. "You are not powerless," I said. The words felt simple, but they weren't. Just because someone questions your ability, I continued, doesn't mean they have the right to take your voice away. I saw it in their faces. The shift. Small, but real. Your life doesn't become less valuable because you've lived it longer, I said. And your independence is not something you owe to anyone else. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was absorbing. And in that moment, I understood something fully. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was something larger, something that could reach beyond what had happened to me. And that was worth everything. Later that night, I returned to my apartment, the quiet wrapping around me again. Familiar now. Comforting. I placed my keys on the small table by the door and paused for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I was aware of where I had been, of what I had faced, and of where I was now. And as I walked further into the room, I realized something that stayed with me long after the lights went out. Growing older doesn't make a woman invisible. It makes her experienced. It makes her aware. And if she chooses to see clearly, it makes her unstoppable. There is a quiet truth that many people are not prepared to face until it touches their own lives. Love without respect is not love at all. It is control, waiting for permission. As we grow older, the world often tries to rewrite our value. It tells us to step aside, to simplify, to depend, to trust that others know better. And sometimes, those voices come from the very people we raised, protected, and sacrificed for. But here is what matters most. Aging does not take away your right to decide your own life. Kindness does not mean surrender, and trust should never be used as a tool against you. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity, and clarity is one of the most powerful things a person can have. Because once you truly see what is happening around you, you are no longer easy to manipulate, to silence, or to replace. Lily's story is not just about loss or betrayal. It is about awakening, about choosing dignity over comfort, truth over illusion, and self-respect over fear. And most importantly, it is about understanding that it is never too late to take your life back. If this story moved you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced something similar or seen it happen to someone close to you? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your voice matters here, and if stories like this speak to your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. You are not alone, and you are never powerless.